Hi, I'm Erik Voss, back from the dead. Vacation. Turns out that bright light actually was hell. And let's do a full breakdown of all the interesting stuff I noticed in Spider-Man Homecoming. Honestly, I was just so giddy as a Ned watching this movie that it was kind of hard to remember, oh right, it's my job to find all the Easter eggs that no one else caught. Don't worry guys, I got the goods. And if you haven't seen Spider-Man Homecoming yet, those goods might actually ruin the movie for you. So spoilers, people, don't let this breakdown do what Sony's trailers did. And if you don't want to get into all these specific details just yet, but you're interested on a super interesting theory on why this movie is so charming and enjoyable, definitely go check out Philip Molina's review. He goes into all that stuff. And yeah, Philip is back. And for more details on that, go check out our channel announcement video. Okay, let's get started with the opening images. This movie opens on this kid's drawing of the Avengers in the Battle of New York. All the big names are there, although the kid drew Hawkeye kind of as an afterthought in the corner. Also, if you look closely, the sketch of the Leviathan coming through the portal kind of looks like a spider in the Avengers shadow, desperate to join them or even get them to turn around and look at him. But I really like how this drawing serves as a symbol for Peter's childhood fantasy of wanting to be an Avenger, and it's that big boy dream that will challenge Peter's desires to stay as this teenage hero with a relatively grounded life. But more on that later. Also, Spider-Man Homecoming is the first Spider-Man movie in the MCU, and I love how this movie totally embraces this Marvel world like a kid playing with new toys. This opening scene takes place in the direct aftermath of the Avengers in New York's Grand Central Station, the same location where Hulk punched Thor out of frame after tackling that Leviathan. In fact, I'm assuming that's the same Leviathan that we see in this scene. Now, Toomes' crew gets halted by the DODC, Department of Damage Control, led by this woman, Anne-Marie Hogue. Now, Hogue and Damage Control are from the Marvel Comics. It was a spin-off series about the team who cleaned up after all the big superhero battles. Marvel actually had plans to develop Damage Control as a TV series on ABC before it ended up getting canceled. Okay, so then the movie jumps forward to 8 years later, and all of us nerds in the audience began to malfunction. Okay, so here's the confusion with this. Up until this point, the Marvel timeline has been pretty straightforward, more or less following our real-world timeline. So like the first Iron Man is set in 2010, and the events of Incredible Hulk and Thor and Captain America First Avenger and Iron Man 2 all take place around the same time in 2011 until Avengers, which is set in 2012. And that is presumably where this scene with Toomes takes place. The problem is the rest of this movie takes place during or 2 months after Captain America Civil War, which we were pretty sure was set in 2016, which was 4 years after the Avengers, not 8 years later. By the way we know all these dates is from specific little Easter eggs in each of these movies. Like in Iron Man 3, we know it was Christmas 2012 from the opening New Year's flashback. And then in Thor: The Dark World, there's a calendar in the background with November 2013. Also, there's the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. that references events in the movies as they happen, which pretty much reinforces this timeline. So why does the movie change the timeline like this, moving it forward 8 years after Avengers when it's clearly impossible if it's also taking place right after Civil War? Now, I would say none of this matters. Maybe we're just nerds being too nitpicky with the details. But come on, this is Marvel, the home of nerds. John Watts actually confirmed that Marvel does have a super detailed timeline scroll for all MCU events going back to the dawn of time. So I'm assuming that this wasn't an accident, and Feige did this for a reason. And I have two theories on this. My first thought is that this is Doctor Strange's fault. Remember, that movie ended with Strange using the Time Stone and the Eye of Agamotto to create a loop in time, rewinding over and over again to eventually defeat Dormammu. So maybe that meddling caused a rift in time, pushing everything 4 years later than it should be. Kind of like when you're streaming something and you keep trying to hop back 10 seconds, then randomly it just jumps forward 10 minutes later and spoils the ending for you. Oh god, no, I regret meddling. Okay, you're right. I know this theory sounds a little nuts, but if this is true, the reason could be that the upcoming Infinity War movies will be so catastrophic and so insane that Doctor Strange will need to use the Time Stone again to reset the timeline back before Civil War to prevent the Avengers infighting so that they can take on Thanos in a more unified front. And that meddling will fix the timeline and close this 8-year gap to reset it back to normal. Huh? Don't you love time travel? Confusion is fun. Anyway, I have another less bonkers theory for this timeline jump that I'll get to in a bit. But first, let's talk about Adrian Toomes, the Vulture, as a villain. I love Michael Keaton's Keaton's adaptation of this guy. He's the first blue-collar, self-made man to appear as a villain in the MCU. Unlike all the other titans of industry and demigods and living planets, he's small-scale and DIY, which makes him a lot like Peter. Actually, Philip does go super in-depth into this whole small-scale approach in Spider-Man Homecoming in his review that you should definitely watch. It's really the whole secret of this movie's success, in my opinion. Now, the other Marvel character featured prominently in these opening scenes is Phineas Mason, aka the Tinkerer from the Marvel Comics. Now, like he does in this movie, the Tinkerer gathers old scraps to make new weaponry for a lot of Marvel characters, including Mysterio, a member of the Sinister Six, who we might see in an upcoming movie. But Philip actually did a post-credit scene breakdown in another video that you should go check out for more details on that. Okay, moving on to this Marvel fanfare, and the music here was composed by Michael Giacchino. This guy's done a ton of stuff. He actually composed the score recently for Doctor Strange, and you probably noticed here how he sampled the 60s Spider-Man theme into the music. But we actually just heard a more subtle choice that Giacchino made in the way that he came up with Vulture's theme music. Now, you can actually hear this on the Homecoming soundtrack in the track called The World is Changing. Giacchino starts with the classic Avengers theme, which we actually heard on that opening shot of the Avengers Tower. But then later, after Toomes says the line,
"The world's changing, boys. It's time we change too,"
the Avengers score twists from a major chord down to a minor chord, and it gives us this darker, more sinister Vulture theme. So just like how Toomes is repurposing the Avengers weaponry and tech for his own sinister goals, Giacchino is repurposing the Avengers music for his evil desires. Yeah, we see you, Giacchino. All right, moving on to Peter's home video footage showing us his side of the Civil War events. And if you look closely at the beginning of it, there's a quick shot of the Unisphere from the World Fair in Queens. Now, this globe was seen in Iron Man 2 when Stark saves a little boy wearing an Iron Man mask. And actually, according to Tom Holland, Kevin Feige decided to retcon this little boy as young Peter Parker. So really, Peter's been part of the MCU as a young Avengers fan for a long time. And this is the other slightly more rational theory on why the movie jumps forward 8 years. So Peter Parker is supposed to be 15 years old in Homecoming. But if the old MCU timeline is true and Iron Man 2 takes place only 4 to 5 years before Homecoming, that would mean this kid in this shot is only 10 to 11 years old. And to me, he looks way younger, maybe like 5 or 6. So it could be just that 8-year time jump was Feige going back to make that Easter egg make a bit more sense. Like Homecoming would need to be 9 or so years after Iron Man 2, or 8 years after Avengers, for this little kid to grow up enough to become Tom Holland. And maybe he just hoped none of us would care this much. Now, of course, pushing everything back like that also seems a little crazy in another way. Like, it would mean there would be a 5-year gap after Avengers where really nothing happened in the MCU until Winter Soldier arrives. And then we'd have to ignore everything in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And we shouldn't. It's a good show. It got really good. So either they jumped 8 years to let this kid grow up and make this minor Easter egg work, or they're setting up a crazy Doctor Strange time travel reset in Infinity Wars, or some other reason that none of us are seeing. Anyway, let me know what you think about this timeline stuff in the comments. And real quick, 2 little things to point out about Peter's videos. I like how when he gets his new Stark designed suit, he says,
"Insane, look at this thing, look at the eyes."
Which I feel like is a meta joke about our reaction when we first saw Spider-Man back in that Civil War trailer. Oh, hey, look at them eyes. Also, Peter does this backflip to talk to Happy, and I'm pretty sure that was a real backflip performed by Tom Holland. Like, apparently this kid is super agile, and John Watts has said that he is in a lot of ways a real life Spider-Man. Okay, moving on past this scene with Stark that we saw a lot in the trailers to Peter's high school, which is full of little winks and references to the Marvel Comics. First, there's Flash Thompson, Peter Parker's longtime bully, played by Tony Revolori. And I like how this movie changes him from the stereotypical brute who's probably in his 30s to someone who actually looks like a kid who bullied you in high school. Like, he's also kind of a nerd. He's just confident. Then in this hilariously poorly produced morning news, there's Betty Brant. In the comics, Betty Brant works at the Daily Bugle. Parker Posey actually played her in the Sam Raimi movies. And her co-host is less noticeable, but that's Jason Iannello. He's one of Flash Thompson's buddies in the comics. Now, Peter's best friend is Ned Leeds, who in the comics is a Bugle reporter and Betty Brant's husband. He later gets brainwashed to become a version of Hobgoblin. But really, this character has a lot more in common with Genki Lee, who is the Miles Morales Spider-Man's best friend in the Ultimate Comics. His whole look and his sense of humor, and the fact that he knows Spider-Man's secret. Yeah, clearly this version of the character is pulling a lot more from the Ultimate Comics. And then of course there's this movie's love interest, Liz Allen, who actually predates Mary Jane Watson and Gwen Stacy in the comics. We also already saw a version of Liz Allen in the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. She's the nerdy girl who says seats taken to Peter on the bus. And then later we see that girl Cindy on Peter's academic decathlon team. That is Cindy Moon, aka Silk from the Spider-Man comics. But my favorite character reference in the school is Principal Morita, played by Kenneth Choi. He also played Jim Morita, the Howling Commando from Captain America: The First Avenger. And this principal is this guy's grandson. He actually keeps an old army photo of his grandfather in his office, which we see later in the movie. And of course, if you look in the background of the school, there are images of Howard Stark, also a picture of Bruce Banner in Peter's classroom. There's also apparently a picture of Abraham Erskine somewhere, but I couldn't find him. But check out that physics problem on the dry erase board that Peter answers. Now the reason he's able to get it so easily without paying attention at all is because it's about the motion of a pendulum, which is the same kind of mental math and physics that Peter does anytime he swings from his web. And later, Peter answers a trivia question on the bus where the answer is strontium, barium, and vibranium. Of course, vibranium is the metal in Cap's shield and the metal weave that forms Black Panther's suit. It'd be funny if all of Peter's intelligence is just based on superhero-related facts. So class, who wrote the Canterbury Tales? Peter. Hulk? We also see Peter make his own webbing, which he calls Web Fluid version 3.01, which some have said might be a reference to the fact that this is the third version of Spider-Man and his webbing that we've seen in the movie. Now, I just love the choice to depict Peter Parker as this impatient teen staring at the clock all day as he waits to run home and play around with his suit. In fact, this long, awkward take of him clumsily changing into the suit in the alley is something that all the other Spider-Man movies have skipped over. But I think it's important for the tone of this film. Like, Peter is an awkward kid, and he's genuinely stoked to be Spider-Man, even if none of these other New Yorkers really care about that. But two guys who do care are these two. They're the ones who asked Spider-Man to do a flip. This older guy holding the boombox is named Kirk Thatcher, and I'm assuming you don't recognize him, but way back in the 80s, he played another punk with the boombox in the movie Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. And yes, that's Kirk and Spock on an 80s subway train. Kevin Feige's actually a big fan of the movie, and he asked Thatcher if he wanted to make a cameo in Spider-Man Homecoming. And then after the Stan Lee cameo, where he yells at Peter for setting off a car alarm, we get this ATM robbery scene. Now the criminals wearing these Avengers masks could be a reference to a similar scene in the Ultimate Comics, but that one had a Batman mask. Or because this is Marvel, it is an unknown black mask with pointy ears. Like, who is this character? He's from a different universe. Also notice how Peter says, "Thor, Hulk, nice to finally meet you." And yeah, that's because Thor and Hulk weren't in that airport battle in Civil War. But when this fight results in the bodega getting blown up, we specifically see Peter save a cat, which of course is a little nod to the famous screenwriting adage that says heroes should do a small missable act of kindness, also known as save the cat, early on at some point in the story. That's why a lot of times in movies you'll just see heroes randomly saving cats. That's kind of an in-joke to that. Then Peter returns to his bedroom where we get a bunch of little visual references to Star Wars with Peter's AT-AT, which is a reference to Peter's line in Civil War.
We're on the snow planet? With the walking thingies!
There are also a bunch of figurines on the shelf and Ned's Lego Death Star. So yeah, one benefit of Disney owning both Marvel and Star Wars is that Spider-Man gets to be as much of a Star Wars obsessed nerd as we were in high school, or long after high school. And then when Ned geeks out over Peter being Spider-Man, some of his dumb questions actually reference things from Spider-Man history. Like he asks if he can spit venom, which feels like a reference to Venom's upcoming solo film. He also asks if he can summon an army of spiders, which Peter kind of does with robotic spiders at some point in the comics. Ned also might be referencing Ant-Man, who can kind of summon an army of ants. Now, if you were wondering, Peter does possess Spidey sense in this movie, even though we don't really see him use it. Jon Watts just chose not to focus on it so much because all the previous Spider-Man films leaned on it a lot. And then there's this moment when Ned says that if he was him, he'd stand on top of a building and shoot his webbing as far as he could, which we saw Tobey Maguire Spiderman do in that first movie. Now, if you were listening closely during this, their teacher actually mentions the Sokovia Accords. Remember, that was the international treaty that caused the rift between Cap and Stark in Civil War. This is just another example of Homecoming grounding Peter as this street-level hero in this Marvel universe with a detail that probably, yeah, would come up in a history or civics class. But my personal favorite example of this in the movie is, of course, Captain America's motivational videos, which we see throughout the movie. Now, I don't know if kids are still watching these in school, but when I was a kid, they showed us these goofy celebrity testimonials all the time. Like, why is Michael Jordan talking to us about drugs? Now, the gym coach, who's played by Hannibal Buress, points out that Cap is considered considered a war criminal, but that he still has to show them these videos anyway. And yeah, if you think about it, you can imagine how Principal Morita would still support his war hero grandfather's old buddy, and really how the whole state of New York would still celebrate its hometown hero. Now in the background, you can see Michelle, Zendaya's character, reading Of Human Bondage. That's a book written by W. Somerset Maugham about being a slave to one's emotions and desires. And this is very on game for Michelle. She's the definition of emotionally detached. I also like how you can see her bench pressing the book while she reads it later. Also later in the movie, on the bus, Michelle reads Invitation to a Beheading by Vladimir Nabokov. It's an existential novel about a man being imprisoned for his inability to fit in with other people in society, which, yeah, another classic loner read. Now, I really like this detail of the girls playing FMK with the Avengers, and Betty said she wanted to F Thor, marry Iron Man, and kill Hulk. And yeah, if you think about it, I guess it makes sense that these New York kids would hate Hulk more than the others, especially if they lived in Harlem. There's a very good chance Hulk smashed one of their houses. Okay, moving on to Liz's party, and this movie does such a good job capturing the feel of being a teenager, with your first house party feeling like the event that will change your life. So yeah, definitely wear that hat. And then later, when Peter sees Bryce showing Aaron this explosive weapon, Bryce mentions how it was an arm from an Ultron minion in Sokovia. He also mentions the black hole grenades, which were featured in Thor: The Dark World. And then, really cool, this shocker weapon was actually modified by Mason from Crossbones' Gauntlet, which we saw Cap knock off his arm back in Civil War. Seriously, I think everything in this movie is recycled from some other Marvel film. It's very environmentally friendly. And then when Peter runs through the backyards to chase the van, some of us might have already felt this was a little familiar, but before we could place it, the movie actually does it for us, cutting to a scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off when Ferris rushes home playing on a TV screen. So Ferris Bueller's Day Off and a lot of the other 80s teen comedies were directed by John Hughes, and his movies were a big influence on Spider-Man Homecoming. That was apparently Kevin Feige's idea, and he actually brought on the Vacation directors John Francis Daley and Jonathan M. Goldstein as co-writers on this script to bring that Hughes-style comedy into it. John Watts said that something about those teen movies feel like high school for all of us. Like, even if you aren't from Chicago, when you think about high school, you think about a high school in Chicago, thanks to John Hughes films. Tom Holland actually said that Watts gave the cast a list of these Hughes movies to watch, including Ferris Bueller and The Breakfast Club, which definitely seems to inspire the scene with Peter in detention. That scene also had Michelle as the loner girl who doesn't even have to be in detention, which is a reference to Ali Sheedy's character in The Breakfast Club.
You want to know what I did to get in here? Nothing. I didn't have anything better to do.
Okay, so then when Toomes snatches Spider-Man, listen closely to the sound that he makes. So the sound editors actually mixed in the caw of a real-life vulture here. And really, when you think about it, the character of the Vulture really is Vulture-like. Like, he scavenges old tech, and vultures as birds are natural scavengers. Okay, moving on, Peter and Ned hack into Stark's suit to disable its training wheels protocol and open up all of its functions. And this could be inspired by that moment in the Civil War comics when Stark gives Spider-Man his new Iron Spider armor, and then Peter later hacks into the armor to rig it the way he wants. Now, I have more on that Iron Spider armor a bit later. Now, the voice of the suit lady AI, Karen, is actress Jennifer Connelly. She played Betty Ross in Ang Lee's Hulk, but also she's married in real life to Paul Bettany, who plays Vision, and before that, the voice of Jarvis, Tony Stark's AI. So way to keep the AI in the family, Tony. Now, there are a few more Easter eggs here. Spider-Man actually hears Toomes' guys talking about the Triskelion mess, which is a reference to the helicarriers in DC and Winter Soldier. They also mention the Lagos incident, which is the Nigerian city at the beginning of Civil War. And then when Spider-Man gets trapped in the DODC storage, he finds in Toomes' bag an old Stark arc reactor and the severed head of an Ultron minion. So the decision to place this sequence in Washington, D.C. set up some nice throwback moments, with Peter running past the Lincoln Memorial reflection pool just like Sam and Cap do in Winter Soldier. Also, the Washington Monument as a landmark could be a reference to Spider-Man's battle with Titanium Man in the Road to Civil War comics. And even though this moment of Spider-Man shooting his webbing to save Liz from falling felt like it might have been a Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man 2 moment, but then I really enjoyed this twist to a different love interest, with Karen telling Peter to kiss Liz upside down, like the iconic MJ kiss in the first Spider-Man. But of course, it doesn't go that way. Let's move on to this scene with Donald Glover's character. Now, in the Ultimate Comics, Aaron is the Prowler, the uncle to Miles Morales. And this scene confirms that when Aaron mentions having a nephew, which firmly establishes Miles Morales in the MCU. And in case you didn't catch it, there's an even more subtle Easter egg here. Aaron's license license plate reads UCSM01, which I'm pretty sure stands for Ultimate Comics Spider-Man issue 01, which was Miles Morales' debut. So even though Glover won't get to play Morales like he did when he voiced the character in the animated series, at least he's playing some role in bringing the character to screen. Okay, moving on to the Fairy, which we already saw a lot of in the trailers, but one new thing to point out is this guy, Matt Gargan, played by Michael Mando from Better Call Saul. On his neck is a tattoo of a scorpion, and that's because in the comics, Matt Gargan is the Scorpion, one of Spider-Man's well-known villains. Actually, in other versions of the comics, Gargan becomes a super violent version of Venom when the symbiote attaches itself to him. So this sequence ends with Stark taking back the suit, giving Peter this lecture.
If you're nothing without this suit, then you shouldn't have it.
This whole idea, I'm pretty sure, is a callback to the debate between Stark and Cap back in the Avengers.
Big man in a suit of armor. Take that off. What are you?
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
See, Stark understands that the suit doesn't make the man, and for Peter, this is a critical step for his growth as a character. Just like Thor having to get his hammer back, Peter has to earn the tool by proving his worth as a hero underneath. And this leads to a really fun shift as we see Peter putting on a different suit, the clothes of a normal teenager, as Aunt May helps him get ready for the homecoming dance. I actually feel like Peter's slide into frame in this scene might have been a reference to Tom Cruise in Risky Business, which could have been another one of those 80s teen comedies that Tom Holland had to watch. Okay, moving on to this big twist that Toombs is Liz's father, creating this perfect blend of the two most tense situations. A guy picking up his date and talking to the dad who clearly hates him, and in a superhero movie, the hero and villain coming face to face. Now, Toombs holds a butcher knife in this scene, which feels like a reference to Norman Osborn carving the turkey in the first Spider-Man, which also had that same nerve-wracking dramatic irony. Now, when they're in the car, there's some interesting lighting choices going on here. Notice how there's this red demonic light glowing on Toombs' face from the stoplight as he starts to figure out who Peter is. And then after a moment, the light switches to green, which in a way is even more menacing. That's the color of Toombs' vulture helmet. And the green light signals that in this moment, he has transformed from slightly intimidating dad to murderous supervillain, the Vulture. The prevalence of the color green is actually very common in these first installments of the Spider-Man movies. Like Sam Raimi actually used the color green often to associate with Green Goblin. Also, green was the color of Dr. Connors the Lizard in The Amazing Spider-Man. Okay, moving on, Peter goes inside to say goodbye to Liz, and you might have noticed that he doesn't lean in to kiss her, unlike what we saw in the trailer. Actually, John Watts said that he included a few shots that were just for the trailers, including the kiss shot and this shot of Spider-Man and Iron Man swooping in together, as well as this test footage of the Vulture. And while using these alternate shots that are only in the trailers makes my job as a trailer breaker downer a bit harder, as a fan, I kinda love this. Like, all I really want for trailers is to give me a sense of what kind of movie this is gonna be, and not spoil exactly how the story will go down. Either way, just make sure what's in the actual movie is better than what's in the trailer. Like, I'll admit, it would have been nice to see Iron Man and Spider-Man flying in formation. There's always Infinity War. Okay, moving on to a few more Easter eggs. Peter does his best Christian Bale Batman voice to intimidate Flash into handing over his car.
Where is she?
And yeah, I kind of feel like taking a dad's sports car for a joyride and ending up wrecking it is another detail pulled from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Actually, seconds earlier, Flash mentions to his date that the Branzino wasn't fresh, which could also be a reference to The Amazing Spider-Man. Remember, Gwen Stacy's mom made Branzino when Peter went over for dinner. Shortly after this scene, we hear Happy say that the inventory on the plane includes Stark's Hulkbuster armor, which we saw in Age of Ultron, and then a prototype for Cap's new shield, probably to replace the damaged one in Civil War, and then Thor's magic belt. Now, Happy couldn't pronounce it, but it's called Meganjoro. I think I got that right. Anyway, it enhances Thor's strength. Now, my favorite joke of the movie was Ned telling the teacher in the computer lab that he was looking at porn, which is also one of my favorite gags from Rick and Morty.
Mr. Smith? Oh yeah, just masturbating!
But the most heart-wrenching moment of the movie comes when Peter is trapped under the rubble. And he feels like such a real kid in this moment, crying out for help. Like, you can obviously tell that he would much rather be awkwardly dancing with all those nerds at homecoming. But then Peter sees his reflection with the Spider-Man mask half covering his face, and he understands Stark's words finally, that he has to be a hero underneath his suit. Also, this visual of Spider-Man trapped under the rubble was another moment pulled from the comics, The Amazing Spider-Man number 33. Now, this finale on Stark's cargo plane looks really cool. cool. I really like surprising viewers by upgrading the plane's look with this cloaking device, which is similar to the bus on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, I'll admit that the CGI spectacle doesn't totally have the same emotional stakes as the other scenes, and Philip actually goes into why that might be the case for you in his review. So again, go take a look at that. But here's what I'm curious about. What's gonna happen to Avengers Tower now that Stark and Happy have finished moving out? One theory that I hope ends up happening in some way is that the tower ends up getting bought by Oscorp. It would be really cool to see this landmark in the MCU turn into something more sinister. But considering Sony still owns the rights to Spider-Man and all of its associated characters, I just don't know if Marvel will be allowed to do that. Anyway, after Peter saves Toomes on the beach, he watches the authorities arrive while sitting on top of the Cyclone roller coaster. Now that is another past MCU reference. In Captain America, Steve and Bucky reminisce over riding the Cyclone on Coney Island until Steve threw up. Anyway, moving on, you might have noticed this kid in a tiger mascot costume running in the background a few times. But of course, Tiger is actually a famous Spider-Man nickname. It's what Mary Jane calls Peter, both in her first line to him in the comics and her final line to him in Spider-Man 2.
Go get him, Tiger.
So I feel like seeing this tiger again here might be foreshadowing this reveal with Michelle, whose friends call her MJ. Yes, how very John Robin Blake of you, Homecoming. Now, Kevin Feige has actually explained that this doesn't mean that Michelle is the same character as Mary Jane Watson. She's a different character, but they're giving her the moniker of MJ to evoke that dynamic with Peter. Remember, the cinematic universe is its own separate universe. It can create and adapt characters and storylines in new directions as much as it wants, and not knowing where they're going is part of that fun. Okay, then when Happy takes Peter to the new Avengers facility upstate, Peter's Science Pun shirt is the same shirt that Pepper Potts wore in Iron Man 3, which may be foreshadowing when she shows up at the end of this scene. But we gotta talk about this new suit. This looks a lot like the Iron Spider armor from the comics. Now, the Iron Spider suit is what Stark designs for Spider-Man in the Civil War comics when he recruits Peter to his side in the war. It's why the colors are the same red and gold color palette. The Iron Spider is super high tech. It can do a ton of stuff, but most prominently, it has these 3 mechanical spider arms called Waldos. But then in this movie, Peter turns it all down, and he doesn't do Stark's press conference either. And both of these are also tied to Civil War, because in those comics, Stark holds a major press conference alongside Spider-Man. But that Spider-Man is way different. He's older at the end of his career, that he actually unmasks himself at the press conference. But the Civil War movie went a very different way. They made Peter Parker younger, still a teen, before he really teams up with the Avengers. So that's why we still haven't really gotten a super advanced Iron Spider yet in the movies, and why we don't get this press conference. It's just not time for that yet. Instead, Stark plans to use the press conference to announce something else, his engagement to Pepper. So Happy said that he's been holding on to this ring since 2008, and Okay, so even though the first Iron Man movie came out in 2008, all the events are set in 2010. So is Happy saying that Stark planned to propose to Pepper since he returned and that was actually 2008? Or was Stark planning to propose to her long before all that happened? Does any of this have any effect on this 8 years later time jump? Look, guys, I don't know. The dates and timelines in this movie are just very confusing, and I at the end of the day, blame Doctor Strange. This is what happens when you meddle. But let's move on to our closing images. After declining Stark's offer to fulfill his childhood dream to join the Avengers, Peter realizes that that goal is no longer something he really needs right now. Like, after not getting the girl and then missing out on all these fun teenage experiences, he realizes he doesn't need to grow up so fast. What he needs is to stay as a teenage hero, a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. So instead of an image of Peter in badass Iron Spider armor alongside the Avengers, we get him back in his old Stark Spider-Man suit, standing in his bedroom in Queens, and that desire to hold on to his youth, which is the essence of Spider-Man as a character as we know him in the comics. Peter has, ironically, grown into a man. Do you think Peter should have taken this new suit? I'll be honest, part of me did die when he didn't just go, hell yeah, and throw that thing on. And I need your help on this one. What do you make of this timeline stuff? Do you think there's anything to my theory about Doctor Strange? If not, what else could it be? Anyway, weigh in on all this stuff in the comments. Also, like this video and share it, and subscribe to New Rockstars because some big things are happening at this channel, so come on board. You can hit me up on Twitter directly at EA Voss, or follow New Rockstars on Twitter at New Rockstars for channel updates. Thank you for watching, and have I been wearing a Captain America shirt this whole time? I thought it was Spider-Man. Why didn't anyone say anything?